And our next delegate is Stephanie Hancherick, resident, City of St. Catharines. And as Councillor Yip has mentioned, matters must be related to those things which are under the sole jurisdiction of the region and are relevant to the motion before us. Anyway, Stephanie Hancherick, you're on.
Good evening. My name is Stephanie, and I'm a mother of two, a small business owner in Niagara, I'm also in my third year of a PhD program at Brock University in the Department of Applied Health Sciences. So I'm speaking on behalf of myself and my children and all those whom I've served. Next slide, please. So today I will discuss COVID-19 as a pandemic and question the stats around COVID-19 in relation to other like illnesses to highlight and bring attention to the Bill of Rights and Charter of Rights and Freedoms for thought. Then I will highlight some evidence from academia that masks offer little protection, ought not to be enough to infringe upon our rights and freedoms. I will then discuss freedom of expression from just one point of view and then conclude by tying it all together. Next slide, please. So my question is, who gets to define and label this as a pandemic if the numbers are consistent with the flu season? Our definition of a pandemic is arbitrary, and based on someone's arbitrary opinion of what a pandemic is, the Government of Canada has invoked the Quarantine Act of 2005. Next slide, please. As you can see, every year, 250,000 to 500,000 people die from influenza globally. In Canada, 12,000 people are typically hospitalized, and influenza typically causes roughly 2,000 more deaths than any other infectious disease. I would like to add to this that the Center of Disease Control recently and quietly updated their data on their website. So if one is clever enough to sift through the jargon, they can see that although over 940,000 deaths are listed as COVID deaths, 94% of those people had underlying serious health conditions and were above the age of 69, which includes heart disease, COPD, cancer, and compromised immune deficiencies. Thus, after doing the math, it appears that the number of actual COVID deaths is roughly around 56,000 globally since December 2019, which falls quite short of the typical influenza year globally. Further, an interesting side note, and since I did raise the question of what a pandemic is, you'll find on the CDC website that the average age of death for someone with COVID-19 is 83 years old, and life expectancy in Canada in 2019 is 82 years old. Next slide, please. So you'll see the data here. Of course, it's tiny. If you need glasses like me, you won't see it, but the influenza death statistics in Canada from 2014 to 18 are there. You'll see that they fall between 6,000 to 9,000 deaths on average a year. And it's 6 on the list. Next slide, please. So to date, COVID stats are 9,193 deaths as of today, printed on Canada's website. And this is with the underlying health conditions being included. So the actual number of deaths from strictly COVID is unknown, but even if 9,139 deaths were strictly COVID, that would still fall within a typical influenza year, although on the higher side. Next slide, please. So the Quarantine Act of 2005 states that every person committing an offense of non-compliance can be convicted on indictment to a fine of not more than $1 million or imprisonment for a term of not more than 3 years or both. Also, every person who fails to comply is liable to a fine of up to $200,000 and 6 months in jail. Next slide, please. The Canadian Bill of Rights states that every law in Canada shall be applied so as not to infringe upon any of the rights or freedoms herein recognized and declared, and in particular no law shall be construed or applied so as to authorize or effect arbitrary detention, imprisonment, or exile of any person. Next slide, please. Further, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms states that everyone has the fundamental freedom of thought, belief, opinion, and expression. Therefore, the Quarantine Act of 2005, used to infringe upon our freedom of expression, is unlawful and as it threatens detention and arbitrary fines for non-compliance with mask mandates. Next slide, please. To further this point, the Bill of Rights, Part 2, 5.1 Act, no act written before or after the Bill of Rights can abrogate, abridge any human right or fundamental freedom before or after this act, which is the Act of 2005. We will put this subject to rest for now. I will now move on to the efficacy of masks, which hinder our communication and thus our freedom of expression with little evidence of their efficacy. Wang et al. States common masks or surgical masks have limited effectiveness in preventing the lungs from harmful substances entering from the environment. These are the basic parameters of the mask that tell us more evidence is needed as to whether masks could protect people in the community. They also conclude that in the face of a disaster like COVID-19, even if the masks cannot be shown to be significantly effective, as an option, we could use it before the evidence is available, just like a Chinese proverb treating a dead horse tentatively as if it were still alive. I thought I would include this last remark as it demonstrates the lack of evidence for mandatory masking and also expresses nicely the popular but nonsensical and non-scientific reason to infringe upon the people's freedom of expression and unlawful use of the Quarantine Act. Nakiachi et al. States in their research that even though the expectation of risk reduction, personal or collective, explained only a small portion of mask usage, motivation superficially irrelevant to disease mitigation strongly promoted mask-wearing behavior. Conformity to the social norm was the most prominent driving force for wearing masks. Thus, the people were wearing masks not for the mitigation, but because they're conforming to social pressures, like the fear of the unlawfully uncompliant fines or jail time stated in the Quarantine Act of 2005. McIntyre et al. Stated that N95 respirators, but not medical masks, were significantly protective against bacterial colonization in healthcare workers. However, the N95 masks have now been shown to hinder oxygen uptake, cause excessive amounts of CO2, and recently a man was in a car accident because he passed out after wearing his N95 mask for far too long. Thus, it's not a feasible solution. Next slide, please. And next slide again. I think I've been moving on. And one more, and one more. Thank you. Okay, that's perfect. Okay. Advani et al. Stated that published data on the efficacy of universal masking policies to prevent healthcare-associated transmission of respiratory viruses are limited, and the generalizability of these results to the ongoing SARS-CoV-2 pandemic is uncertain. I've given a small sample of the more current research on the inefficacy of masks to demonstrate that if our rights and freedoms will be infringed upon, shall it not be for something that has demonstrated scientific backing? We will let this go for now. Next slide, please. I argue that mandatory masking infringes on Canadians' freedom of expression, and I have taken one small point of view from the scientific literature, and that is what defines expression. Books upon books have been written on the topic of communication, and most linguists will be able to tell you that roughly 93 to 90% of communication is nonverbal. Authors Matt L. state that facial appearance was found to determine how messages were processed. Next slide, please. Stoughton de Kramer, 2012, provide evidence that individuals must see facial expressions to understand the underlying message that is being spoke, stating that facial expressions of emotions may shape a context in which communication may be perceived differently. And facial displays of emotion lead people to perceive others' emotional state, and that in addition, people further use these emotional signals and subsequent interpretations to guide their actions. And displays of happiness communicate appeasement and feelings of reassurance, thereby discouraging aggressive or flight responses in others. They state this is how trust is built, and they also state that displays of anger communicate danger and allow for specific appropriate responses. Next slide, please. So Bruman states that 6 distinct emotions can be registered with the facial expressions, including anger, disgust, fear, happiness, sadness, and surprise, all of which are elements of our freedom of expression. Next slide, please. Spabe et al. Present evidence that facial expression is a necessary component of communication to express emotion, and lack in facial expression, according to the study, hinders empathy. So messages are not clear without facial expression, and mandatory masks stunts entire population's ability to express themselves freely. Next slide, please. So conclusively, and to sum up my brief presentation, the statistics generated from COVID-19 do not rationalize as a pandemic that is different than any other influenza year. Quarantine Act 2005 is unlawful given that the Bill of Rights states that no other law either created before or after the Bill of Rights can overshadow the Bill of Rights, thus fining or imprisoning an individual based on noncompliance is illegal, since masking and detaining for non-masking infringes on the rights and freedoms of expression and liberty. Masks have not demonstrated their ability to stop the spread. Communication as our fundamental freedom of expression is largely in part due to facial expression, and without the ability to read facial expression, individuals are hindered from their right to communicate and be understood and to understand others. It is illegal to force mandatory masks on a population, and this is specifically outlined in the Bill of Rights, Part 2, Section 5.1. The right to civil suit for this infringement will likely be exercised by the people of Canada if mandatory mask bylaws continue to infringe upon the people's freedom of expression and freedom of liberty, such as in British Columbia with Tanya Ga, who started Action for Canada. She has hired a lawyer to take BC Province of Canada to court for the wrongful lockdown measures and has the support of thousands of Canadians nationwide. Another lawyer, Rocco Gelati,
Thank you very much. The time has
against the federal
expired.
government as well. Please vote no. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your delegation.
Thank you.
I will now call on Cheryl Rowe for her delegation. Let Sean begin